Iraq, 8,000 plus death row inmates. Our journey begins in Iraq, a nation that tops our grim rankings with over 8,000 individuals awaiting execution. To understand how Iraq came to house the world's largest death row population, we must first comprehend the perfect storm of circumstances that created this humanitarian catastrophe. The roots of Iraq's death row crisis stretch back to the aftermath of the 2003 US-led invasion, but the situation reached apocalyptic proportions following the rise and fall of ISIS between 2013 and 2019, as Iraqi forces, supported by international coalitions, gradually reclaimed territory from the Islamic State. They captured thousands of suspected ISIS members, sympathizers, and anyone unfortunate enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. What followed was not justice, but a grotesque perversion of it. Mass trials post-ISIS result in swift sentences, with inmates packed into sweltering, torture-ridden prisons. The Iraqi government, under immense pressure to demonstrate swift action against terrorism, established what can only be described as conveyor belt courts, where trials lasting mere minutes determined life or death outcomes for hundreds of defendants. Survivors described trials lasting mere minutes, leading to confessions extracted through electric shocks and waterboarding in Baghdad's notorious prisons. The legal proceedings themselves were a mockery of due process. Defendants were often denied access to lawyers until moments before their trials began. Court-appointed attorneys, when provided at all, typically met their clients for the first time as they entered the courtroom. These lawyers, working under enormous pressure and facing implicit threats if they mounted too vigorous a defense, routinely advised defendants to confess and seek mercy rather than fight charges that had already been predetermined. The torture methods employed to extract confessions were systematic and brutal. Detainees described being suspended from ceilings for hours, having electric cables attached to sensitive body parts, being subjected to sexual assault and humiliation, and witnessing the torture of family members brought in to increase psychological pressure. Perhaps most horrifically, some detainees report being forced to sign confessions written in Arabic that they could not read, trusting their torturers' claims about what the documents contained. One survivor recounted the constant fear of dawn raids for hangings, with cells so packed that prisoners sleep in shifts on concrete floors slick with sweat and despair. The stench within these facilities is overwhelming, a combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food, and the metallic smell of blood from beatings administered by guards. Ventilation is virtually non-existent, and in summer months, the concrete walls radiate heat like ovens, making breathing difficult and sleep nearly impossible. Many inmates develop respiratory problems, skin infections, and severe dehydration that goes untreated for months or years. Pakistan, 800 plus death row inmates. Pakistan's death row population of over 3,800 individuals represents one of the most complex and troubling applications of capital punishment in the modern world. What makes Pakistan's situation particularly disturbing is not just the sheer number of people awaiting execution, but the wide range of offenses that can result in a death sentence and the systematic way in which the country's blasphemy laws have been weaponized to target minorities and settle personal scores. Blasphemy, murder, and drug crimes result in decades-long waits in squalid cells marked by beatings and isolation. Asia Bibi spent nearly a decade in solitary confinement before her 2018 acquittal, enduring threats and isolation that left her psychologically scarred. Her ordeal began in 2009 with what should have been an unremarkable incident, a dispute over drinking water with Muslim co-workers in the fields of rural Punjab. The argument escalated when Asia Bibi, a Christian, was accused of making derogatory remarks about the Prophet Muhammad. What followed was nearly a decade of hell that illuminates the broader crisis of Pakistan's death row system. She described her cell as a windowless box, where the only sound was her own prayers amidst death threats scrawled on walls. For years, Asia Bibi lived in complete isolation, her only human contact coming through a slot in her cell door through which guards passed her meager meals. But Asia Bibi's case, while internationally prominent, is just one thread in a much larger tapestry of injustice. Pakistan's blasphemy laws have been used to target religious minorities, settle property disputes, silence political opponents, and eliminate business rivals. Once an accusation is made, the accused person becomes a marked individual, facing not just potential execution by the state, but immediate danger from religious extremists who view killing blasphemers as a religious duty. The blasphemy law system in Pakistan operates with a presumption of guilt that makes fair trials virtually impossible. Accusations often stem from personal disputes that have nothing to do with religion. But once the charge is made, the entire legal and social system aligns against the accused. Lawyers who agree agree to defend blasphemy cases face death threats. Judges who acquit defendants are targeted for assassination, and police officers who fail to pursue cases vigorously face accusations of being complicit in blasphemy themselves. Suicide attempts are common, though they are often unsuccessful due to the constant surveillance and the removal of any objects that could be used for self-harm. Some inmates deliberately provoke violent confrontations with guards, preferring a quick death from beating to the prolonged agony of waiting for execution. Nigeria, 3036 plus death row inmates. Nigeria's death row population of over 3,036 individuals represents one of Africa's most severe human rights crises, rooted in a criminal justice system that has been overwhelmed by decades of economic hardship, political instability, and social upheaval. What makes Nigeria's situation particularly tragic is the way in which poverty, corruption, and inadequate legal representation have created a death penalty system that disproportionately targets the most vulnerable members of society. Armed robbery, kidnapping, and murder charges result in overcrowded jails that breed disease, with inmates facing starvation and guard violence. The Nigerian death row experience is characterized by conditions so appalling that many international observers have described them as torture facilities masquerading as prisons. In Lagos alone, the country's commercial capital, death row inmates are housed in facilities originally designed for a few dozen prisoners but now holding hundreds. The overcrowding is so severe that inmates take turns standing because there isn't enough floor space for everyone to sit simultaneously. During Nigeria's rainy season, which can last for months, poorly constructed roofing allows water to flood the cells, forcing inmates to stand in ankle-deep water mixed with human waste and refuse. The case of Chijioke Stephen Obioha shows how impoverished couriers face death far from home. Obioha was a 26-year-old man struggling to support his family when he agreed to transport what he was told were precious metals to Singapore. The package actually contained heroin, and under Singapore's strict drug laws, he was sentenced to death. His family, back in Nigeria, spent years fighting for his life, selling everything they owned to pay for legal appeals. The day of his execution, his mother was still trying to raise money for a final legal challenge. Nigeria's death rows hold inmates in Lagos prisons where malaria festers and guards demand bribes for food. Armed robbery cases make up a significant portion of Nigeria's death row population, a legacy of military governments in the 1970s that made armed robbery a capital offense even when no one was killed. Many of these cases involve young men who committed desperate crimes driven by poverty and unemployment, often stealing small amounts of money or goods, but facing death sentences because they carried weapons during the commission of their crimes. The food situation in Nigerian death row facilities is a form of slow torture. Official prison rations are inadequate to sustain life, consisting of small portions of rice or cornmeal with little nutritional value. Inmates must rely on family members to bring additional food, but many families are too poor to provide regular supplements. Those without family support often suffer from severe malnutrition, leading to a variety of health problems that go untreated in the prison's medical facilities. United States, 2,382 death row inmates. The United States presents perhaps the most paradoxical case in our examination of global death row populations. As a wealthy, democratic nation with strong legal institutions and constitutional protections, America's death row population of 2,382 individuals represents a different kind of tragedy. One where systematic racial bias, geographic inequality, and prosecutorial misconduct have created a two-tiered justice system that makes a mockery of the principle of equal treatment under law. Murder with aggravating factors leads to sentences characterized by racial disparities, with inmates enduring sensory deprivation in isolation. The American death penalty system has been extensively documented and studied, yet it continues to operate with biases so profound that they would be shocking in any other context. The most striking aspect of America's death row is its racial composition. Over 40% of death row inmates are black, despite black Americans comprising only about 13% of the total population. The story of Damien Echols provides a powerful illustration of how America's death penalty system can fail innocent individuals. Echols spent 18 years on Arkansas's death row before being exonerated and released as part of the West Memphis 3 case. Damien Echols spoke of losing the sensation of rain or stars, confined in a cell where time itself felt like a punishment. "You forget what it's like to feel grass under your feet or hear birds sing," Echols described in interviews following his release. His account of life on death row reveals the psychological torture inherent in America's system of prolonged isolation. For nearly 2 decades, Echols was confined to a concrete cell smaller than most people's bathrooms, allowed out only for an hour of exercise in a slightly larger concrete enclosure. He lost teeth due to inadequate dental care, suffered from chronic health problems that went untreated, and experienced a complete disconnection from the natural world. Since 1973, the U.S. has exonerated 197 death row inmates, often due to inadequate legal representation. This statistic represents not just individual tragedies, but a systemic failure of American justice. Each exoneration represents years or decades of an innocent person's life stolen by a system that promised but failed to deliver justice. The psychological impact on exonerated individuals is profound. Many struggle with PTSD, difficulty forming relationships, and an inability to trust institutions that failed them so catastrophically. The geographic concentration of America's death penalty reveals stark inequalities in how justice is administered. While some states have abolished capital punishment entirely, others execute inmates regularly. This creates a situation where identical crimes committed in different states result in vastly different punishments, violating basic principles of equal justice under law. Bangladesh, 800+ death row inmates. Bangladesh's death row population of over 1,800 individuals represents a particularly troubling example of how rapid industrialization, political instability, and an overburdened justice system can combine to create a human rights catastrophe. What makes Bangladesh's situation especially concerning is the speed with which death sentences are imposed and the conditions under which inmates await their fate in one of the world's most densely populated countries. Murder and drug trafficking cases are processed through rapid tribunals that sentence hundreds annually, leaving inmates in humid, rat-infested wards with minimal medical care. The Bangladeshi approach to capital punishment reflects a government under enormous pressure to demonstrate decisive action against crime and terrorism, but the result has been a system that prioritizes speed over accuracy and political expediency over justice. The physical conditions in Bangladesh's death row facilities are among the worst documented anywhere in the world. Located in a country where monsoon rains can flood entire regions for months and where temperatures and humidity levels make even outdoor conditions nearly unbearable, the prisons housing death row inmates are overcrowded concrete structures with minimal ventilation and no climate control. Women sentenced for killing abusive partners face humid, vermin-infested cells, their cases rushed through tribunals that prioritize speed over justice. Bangladesh's death row includes dozens of women, many of whom were sentenced for killing husbands or male relatives who had subjected them to years of abuse. These cases highlight the intersection of gender-based violence and capital punishment in societies where women have limited legal protections and few options for escaping abusive situations. The story of one such woman illustrates the broader tragedy of Bangladesh's death penalty system. Rashida, a 32-year-old mother of 3, killed her husband after years of beatings that had left her partially deaf and with permanent scarring. Her husband had threatened to kill her children if she ever tried to leave. When police found his body, Rashida was sitting beside it, making no attempt to flee or conceal what had happened. At her trial, which lasted less than 2 hours, no evidence of the years of abuse was presented, and no expert testimony about domestic violence was allowed. War crimes tribunals established to address atrocities committed during the 1971 Independence War have been criticized for their lack of due process and their focus on members of opposition political parties. These tribunals have added dozens of individuals to Bangladesh's death row, many in cases where the evidence was questionable and the proceedings were politically motivated rather than genuinely focused on justice for historical crimes. The medical care available to Bangladesh's death row inmates is virtually non-existent. In a country where the general population struggles to access adequate health care, death row inmates are at the very bottom of any priority list. Preventable diseases like tuberculosis, dengue fever, and cholera spread rapidly through the overcrowded facilities, and many inmates die from illness before their executions can be carried out. Malaysia, 1,360 death row inmates. Malaysia's death row population of 1,360 individuals presents a particularly stark example of how drug policy intersects with capital punishment to create a system that disproportionately targets the most vulnerable members of society. What makes Malaysia's situation uniquely troubling is the country's mandatory death penalty for certain drug offenses, which removes any judicial discretion and has resulted in death sentences for individuals who are clearly victims rather than kingpins of international drug trafficking operations. Drug offenses dominate dominate, with migrants facing language barriers and harsh solitary confinement in tropical heat. Malaysia's approach to drug crimes reflects a broader regional trend in Southeast Asia, where governments have adopted increasingly harsh penalties in an attempt to stem the flow of narcotics through their territories. The demographics of Malaysia's death row reveal the deeply inequitable nature of the country's capital punishment system. A significant percentage of those awaiting execution are foreign nationals, many from neighboring countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and Bangladesh, who were recruited by trafficking organizations specifically because their poverty and desperation made them easy targets for recruitment. Language barriers compound every aspect of the injustice faced by foreign nationals on Malaysia's death row. Many defendants do not speak Malay or English fluently enough to understand the charges against them, the legal proceedings, or even the sentences imposed upon them. Court-appointed translators are often inadequately trained, and crucial nuances in testimony can be lost in translation. Some defendants have reported learning they had been sentenced to death only days or weeks after their trials concluded, when family members or fellow inmates explained the verdict to them. The conditions of confinement on Malaysia's death row reflect the country's tropical climate and overcrowded prison system. Death row inmates are housed in concrete cells with minimal ventilation, where temperatures can exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity levels that make the air feel thick enough to cut with a knife. Solitary confinement is used extensively in Malaysia's death row facilities, ostensibly for security reasons but often as a form of additional punishment. Inmates describe spending 23 hours per day in cells barely large enough to lie down in, with their only human contact coming during brief periods when guards deliver food or escort them to shower facilities. These courier recruitment operations represent a form of human trafficking, with criminal organizations exploiting the desperation of vulnerable individuals to serve their own purposes. The harsh mandatory sentences ensure that even if couriers are caught and interrogated, they have no useful information to trade for leniency because they were never intended to be part of the actual criminal organization. Sri Lanka's 300-plus death row inmates. Sri Lanka's death row population of over 1,300 individuals exists in a state of perpetual uncertainty that exemplifies one of the cruelest aspects of capital punishment, the psychological torture of indefinite waiting. What makes Sri Lanka's situation particularly tragic is the country's maintenance of an unofficial moratorium on executions since 1976, while continuing to sentence people to death, creating a form of limbo that may be worse than swift execution. Murder and narcotics charges result in moratorium that offers false hope in flood-prone colonial-era prisons. Sri Lanka has maintained an unofficial moratorium on executions since 1976, yet continues to sentence people to death, creating a limbo that may be worse than swift execution. The infrastructure of Sri Lanka's prison system dates back to the British colonial era, with facilities that were inadequate even when they were built over a century ago. Inmates endure psychological strain in colonial-era prisons plagued by floods and abuse. During monsoon season, which can last for months, many death row cells flood with contaminated water that inmates must live in for weeks at a time. Welikada Prison, which houses many of Sri Lanka's death row inmates, has become synonymous with human rights violations. The facility, built in 1841, was designed to hold a few hundred prisoners but now houses thousands. Death row inmates are kept in the most overcrowded sections, where cells designed for 2 people regularly hold 8 or more. The Victorian-era architecture, while historically significant, creates nightmarish conditions for modern incarceration, with poor drainage, inadequate lighting, and ventilation systems that were never designed for tropical climates. The psychological impact of Sri Lanka's indefinite moratorium cannot be overstated. Unlike countries where executions are carried out regularly, giving inmates some sense of timeline, or countries that have completely abolished the death penalty, Sri Lanka's approach leaves inmates in complete uncertainty about their fate. Some have been on death row for over 3 decades, watching their families age and die while they remain trapped in legal limbo. Sri Lanka's death row includes significant numbers of individuals convicted of drug-related offenses, many of them poor fishermen who were recruited to transport narcotics by boat between India and Sri Lanka. These individuals, desperate for income in an economy devastated by civil war and natural disasters, often had little understanding of the severity of the penalties they faced or the international scope of the trafficking operations they became involved in. The country's prolonged civil war, which lasted from 1983 to 2009, created conditions that contributed to both crime and harsh responses to it. The breakdown of normal social structures, the proliferation of weapons, and the normalization of violence during the conflict created an environment where capital punishment seemed like a necessary response to social chaos. However, the end of the war has not led to a corresponding reduction in death sentences or improvement in prison conditions. Indonesia, 852 death row inmates. Indonesia's death row population of 852 individuals reflects the country's harsh approach to drug trafficking, which has resulted in some of the most internationally controversial executions in recent years. What makes Indonesia's situation particularly troubling is the government's use of capital punishment as a tool of international diplomacy, executing foreign nationals despite intense diplomatic pressure and evidence of rehabilitation. Drug smuggling and terrorism charges result in confinement in Bali's Karabokan prison and other facilities with corrupt, riot-prone conditions. Indonesia's zero-tolerance approach to drug crimes has put the country at odds with international human rights organizations and foreign governments whose citizens face execution. Bali's Karabokan prison, which houses many foreign nationals on death row, has become infamous for its corruption and violence. Foreigners endure corrupt, riot-prone conditions in facilities like Bali's Karabokan prison. The prison, originally designed for 300 inmates, regularly houses over 1,000, with death row inmates often kept in the most overcrowded and dangerous sections. The case of the Bali Nine, a group of Australians caught attempting to smuggle heroin out of Indonesia, illustrates the international controversy surrounding Indonesia's death penalty. Two of the group's leaders were executed in 2015 despite years of international diplomatic pressure and evidence of their rehabilitation while in prison. Their executions strained relations between Indonesia and Australia and highlighted the arbitrary nature of how Indonesia applies its death penalty. Andrew Chan and Mayuran Sukumaran, the two Bali Nine members who were executed, had spent over a decade on death row and had undergone remarkable transformations during their imprisonment. Chan became a Christian pastor who ministered to fellow inmates, while Sukumaran became an accomplished artist whose work was exhibited internationally. Their cases raised fundamental questions about whether people who had clearly been rehabilitated should face execution for crimes committed in their youth. Indonesia's execution protocol involves firing squads, and death row inmates are given only 72 hours notice before their executions are carried out. This short notice period means that families often cannot arrange to visit their loved ones before the execution, and legal appeals must be rushed through the system without adequate time for preparation. The execution site on Nusa Kambangan Island, known as Alcatraz Island, is deliberately isolated to prevent protests and limit media coverage. Thailand, 509 death row inmates. Thailand's death row population of 509 individuals includes some of the most politically sensitive cases in the world, as the country's strict lèse-majesté laws make even mild criticism of the monarchy a capital offense. What makes Thailand's situation particularly troubling is the way political considerations influence death penalty cases and the extreme restrictions placed on discussing or reporting these cases. Murder, drugs, and royal insults result in confinement in Bangkok's Big Tiger prison, where chains and leg irons are common. Bang Kwang prison, known as the Big Tiger, has become synonymous with the harshest conditions in Thailand's prison system. Bangkok's Bang Kwang prison chains inmates for crimes like insulting the monarchy, with leg irons cutting into skin during years of waiting. The use of leg shackles in Thai prisons is routine for death row inmates, with heavy iron restraints that make movement difficult and cause permanent damage to legs and feet over time. These shackles are welded onto inmates' legs and are only removed at death, creating both physical pain and a constant psychological reminder of their condemned status. Thailand's lèse-majesté laws are among the strictest in the world, with sentences of up to 15 years in prison for each count of insulting the monarchy. In the most serious cases, or when multiple counts are involved, defendants can face death sentences. These laws have been used to prosecute individuals for social media posts, private conversations reported by informants, and even academic discussions about the role of monarchy in Thai society. The political nature of many lèse-majesté cases means that defendants often become symbols in Thailand's ongoing political struggles. Families of those charged frequently face harassment and threats, and lawyers who agree to represent defendants in these cases often see their own careers and safety threatened. The atmosphere of fear surrounding these cases makes it difficult for defendants to receive adequate legal representation or for accurate information about their cases to reach the public. Death row inmates in Thai prisons face extreme restrictions on communication with the outside world. Letters are heavily censored, phone calls are monitored and limited, and visits from family members are strictly controlled. Many foreign nationals on Thailand's death row go years without seeing family members due to the distance and expense involved in traveling to Thailand. The isolation is compounded by language barriers and cultural differences that make it difficult for foreign inmates to form relationships with other prisoners or prison staff. Thailand's approach to capital punishment has become increasingly militarized, with executions carried out by firing squad in a ceremony that emphasizes the power of the state over individuals. individual life. Death row inmates are given traditional Thai last meals and are allowed to make final statements, but these statements are heavily censored and often not released to the public, particularly in politically sensitive cases. India, 488 death row inmates. India's death row population of 488 individuals represents the smallest number on our list, but the conditions and legal processes involved are no less troubling than those in countries with larger populations. What makes India's situation particularly complex is the country's struggle to balance its democratic institutions and constitutional protections with public demands for harsh punishment of heinous crimes. Murder, terrorism, and rape charges result in prolonged appeals in Tihar jail that lead to mental breakdowns amid filth and abuse. India's death penalty system is characterized by extremely long delays between sentencing and execution, with some inmates spending decades on death row as their cases move through multiple levels of appeal. Tihar Jail in New Delhi, which houses many of India's most high-profile death row inmates, is one of the largest prison complexes in the world. The facility, originally designed for a much smaller population, has been expanded repeatedly but remains severely overcrowded. Death row inmates are kept in separate sections with heightened security, but the basic conditions, poor sanitation, inadequate medical care, and constant overcrowding, are similar throughout the complex. The case of the Delhi gang rape convicts illustrates both the best and worst aspects of India's justice system. The investigation was thorough, the evidence was overwhelming, and the legal proceedings, while lengthy, included multiple levels of review. However, the intense media coverage and public demands for execution created an atmosphere where a commutation of the death sentences would have been politically impossible, regardless of other considerations such as the defendants' mental health, their backgrounds of poverty and abuse, or the principle that the state should not take life even in response to the most heinous crimes. India's approach to the death penalty has evolved significantly over the decades, with the Supreme Court establishing the rarest of rare standard that theoretically limits death sentences to the most exceptional cases. However, the application of this standard remains inconsistent, with similar crimes sometimes resulting in vastly different sentences depending on the court, the region, and the political climate at the time of trial. This inconsistency undermines the principle of equal justice under law and creates a system where chance and circumstance play too large a role in determining who lives and who dies. The families of India's death row inmates face enormous emotional and financial burdens as they navigate the complex appeals process. Legal fees can bankrupt families, forcing them to choose between fighting for their loved one's life and meeting basic needs like food, shelter, and medical care for other family members. The social stigma associated with having a family member on death row can be devastating, with children of the condemned facing discrimination at school and family members losing jobs or being ostracized by their communities. The technological advances that have transformed much of Indian society have largely bypassed the country's prison system, leaving death row inmates in facilities that lack basic amenities like reliable electricity, clean water, and modern sanitation. This technological gap creates additional hardships for inmates and their families, who must navigate modern legal and communication systems while their loved ones remain trapped in institutions that have changed little since the colonial era.